This is a survey of the art of the Italian Renaissance in the 15th century. The early Renaissance was a period which lasted from roughly 1400 to 1500, although depending upon whom you ask, you may see slightly different starting and ending years for this period. We will cover some of the most important artistic works during this period and discuss why they were important in the history of art. The early Renaissance was a very remarkable period of time in which the arts, especially in the areas of painting and sculpture, flourished to a very high degree. In this lecture, I will talk about some of the changes and advancements that were made which had a very strong impact on the world of art. Some of the best-known works of art from the history of art were created during this time. Now, the early Renaissance would lead into a period after it, which was called the High Renaissance. And the High Renaissance lasted roughly about 1485 or so until about 1520. Now, we will not be covering the High Renaissance in this lecture, but I think it is good for you to be aware of it. Now, in some respects, the High Renaissance was a culmination of the advances made in the early Renaissance. The High Renaissance was a period of time when Italy produced artists who are widely considered to be its greatest artists, and these are artists who are known throughout the world, such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael. Now, even in our world today, learning about works from the period of the early Renaissance is very important for our own visual literacy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, many works from this time period in the 15th century are known all around the world, and you may see references to these works in the news, in literature, in pop culture. So studying the original works in their context, in their historical context, gives us a foundation upon which we can better understand the works themselves and the artists who created them. Before we begin talking about the art of the Renaissance, I want to point out a few things about Italy in general. Here we're looking at a map of Italy which shows some of the major cities. You can see Rome in the very center of the map. Directly to the north along the Adriatic Sea is the great city of Venice. The northwestern part of Italy, near the French border, are cities such as Genoa, Milan, and Turin. Now, in the 1400s, Italy did not exist as a unified country similar to the one we are familiar with today. Instead, the Italian peninsula was governed by many separate rulers. Especially in the north, independent city-states governed their own territories, and these cities were oftentimes rivals with one another. Now, these rivalries sometimes became so intense that these cities would wage war with one another. However, on a more peaceful level, they would still compete, but in other cultural areas. For example, one city might build a very large cathedral, and in response, some years later, another city would build an even larger cathedral. So there was this spirit of competition present in Italy at this time in the 1400s. Now, this was also the age of humanism. One of the most important influences on art produced in early Renaissance was humanist thought. Now, humanism was not a religion, but it was not necessarily anti-religious either, and we know this because there were Christian humanists who wrote and lived during this time. Now, humanism can be described as a way of thinking which places a high value on the intellect of the individual and a high appreciation for the classical world. Now, when I refer to the classical world, I'm referring to primarily to the world of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Humanists greatly admired the writings of the ancients. They also admired their large buildings that they were able to construct, especially those which were readily visible in Rome, and also the highly lifelike statues that the ancients were able to carve. And there were plenty of those in Rome that people in the Renaissance were able to look at. Now, humanism was something new at this time, and it was not really present in the medieval world which preceded the Renaissance. So this marks a contrast between the Renaissance world and the medieval world, or the medieval mindset, which came before it. One city is associated with the early Renaissance more than any other city, and that city is Florence. It's located north of Rome, but south of many of the major Italian cities in the north, such as Venice and Milan. It's located in a region called Tuscany. Now, Tuscany gets its name from the ancient Etruscan people who lived in this region around the time of the ancient Romans. Now, Florence existed as an independent city-state, and so it warred with other powers at the time. One of the cities that it would war with was the city of Milan, and some of the warring between the city-states had an influence on the art that was produced in Florence, and so we'll take a look at that in just a moment. Now, Florence had grown in size and power over the years, and one of its most important buildings was a building in the city center called the Baptistery. Now, this baptistery was a place where Christian initiation took place, that is, the bringing people into the Christian faith by means of baptism with water. Now, it was obviously an important religious building in the city, but it was also an important civic building as well. Anyways, the baptistery was constructed around the year 1059, and so it was actually there in Florence for a long time before the Renaissance period begins. But it is at this baptistery that the Renaissance really starts to take place. And we can actually go to a certain year and a certain event that happened in the year 1401 for the beginning of the early Renaissance in Florence.